People coming?
No, now you can start.
Okay. Okay. Hello. Welcome, everyone. My name is Maria Vergara. I'm researcher at the Faculty of Architecture at Delft University of Technology. Thank you for attending our Urban Thinker campus on the new urban normal, urban sustainability, and resilience post-COVID-19. And I would like to give you a bit of context regarding this event. It is organized by the Faculty of Architecture and the Global Urban Lab in partnership with the World Urban Campaign. This is the UN Habitat platform in charge of promoting the implementation of the new urban agenda. And we put here in the chat the link to the World Urban Campaign, where you can find the complete overview of all UTCs organized around the world. And for those that don't know, the Urban Thinker Campus are instrumental platforms for stakeholders to get together in order to make the decisions about implementing the new urban agenda. This is our second UTC. The first UTC organized by TU Delft was in 2017, and the title was Education for the City We Need. And again, you can find the link in this chat if you want to take a look at the report, which is open access. And this event itself is organized by the Global Urban Lab, which is a program under the umbrella of TU Delft Global. And we are a communication and action platform that brings visibility and articulation to staff and students working on topics of urbanization in the global south, or also, as we call it, underrepresented geographies. The link to our website again is in the chat box. And yeah, so this is from my side, and now I leave you now with Igor, and who will explain more about the program and will introduce the speakers.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Igor Pessoa. I'm also a postdoctoral researcher from Delft, University of Technology. And as you can see on your screen now, this is our program for today. So after this very brief introduction from Luz Maria and myself, we're going to have the number 2 in our agenda is 4 pitches of 10 minutes of our international guests coming from different countries. Then we're going to have a short summary by Roberto and Caroline. And then we have our roundtable discussion. So today we are going to discuss the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic in a number of cities in the global south. We are going to hear from young scholars and practitioners from the cities. They will give an account about the impacts of pandemic on their cities and regions. And we also discuss some far-reaching implications of the pandemic in the mid and long term. Our city is going to be the same as after the pandemic. Is anything really hanging, or are we going back to business as usual? Is this an opportunity to build better back? So just as a quick clarification, we're also going to record this session and put it online afterwards in the Global Lab webpage. And our 4 speakers for today are Mridula Koshi from India, but she's actually now based in Norway. She's a PhD candidate in the Norwegian University of Science and Technology. We also have from Brazil, Igor Carvalho. He's also a PhD candidate from the University of São Paulo, and he's a former advisor for the Secretary of Housing of the City of São Paulo. We have, after Igor, we're going to have Javier Ruiz Tagle, based in Santiago, from the Pontifical Catholic University of Chile. And the last, I think in our agenda, sorry, I think in the slide it's inverted. It's George Zaborsky from Minsk, Belarus. He's an architect and planner based in Minsk. So we'll introduce them properly as they start their talk. The UTC is a part of a three-part series, which will explore the questions that we mentioned here before. This is just the first episode. The second one will take place in the 24th of June at 6 o'clock in Amsterdam time. And this will include representatives of the European Commission, the UK Green Party, and the UK think tank Commonwealth. They will discuss the European Green Deal and the UK New Green Deal and the impacts of the COVID-19 to this green transition. And then we're gonna have our third event on Monday, the 13th of July at 6 o'clock, also Amsterdam time, which Julio Davila, the director of the Barlett's Development Planning Unit, will start questioning the assumed link between rapid urbanization and the emergence of zoonotic disease and try to enrich this debate by including the effects of structural drivers such as poverty and inequality and their spatial embeddedness. Caroline Skinner, the director of the urban research at WIGO and senior research at the Africa Center for Cities at the University of Cape Town, would also discuss with us some important lessons that we need to take away from the current crisis with regard to the informal economy and the need to provide space for the informal economy. Furthermore, we aim to look at the effects of COVID-19 on urban life and a number of African cities. So you can also enroll for these events on Facebook and in the Global Urban Lab website. So now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker, which will be Amrula Koshi. She's a lecturer and doctoral researcher from India and currently based in, as I mentioned, in the Norwegian University of Science and Technology in Trondheim. Her research concerns planning for uncertainty in developmental contexts, which face unexpected environmental crises due to the climate change. In her capacity as an urban designer and planner, she worked at various urbanism offices in the Netherlands regarding long-term initiatives in energy landscape, urban metabolism, post-food and energy scenarios, and multi-scalar design solutions for transitions to renewable energy use, circular economy, productive cities, and sustainable mobility infrastructure. Through her experience on polycentric urban agglomeration, mainly in the Randstad in the Netherlands, metropolitan cities regions like in Delhi, the national capital region, dispersed territories, Veneto and Limburg, and Tabula Rasa, Augusta, Al-Dahor in Oman, she places emphasis on the strategic importance of cross-border cooperation, regional strategy, and networked cities to address uncertainties in different spatial contexts. So I welcome Amrula, and you are now, please, you can start sharing your presentation. Thank you for joining us today.
She's asking to unmute her. Maybe
Yes,
you can do it, yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Luz and Igor, for that nice introduction. So I'm going to start sharing my screen so we can have the discussion already. Could you enable me to share my screen, please?
I think, let me check. Yes, now you can share
Okay,
screen.
great. Are you able to see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. Thanks a lot for that wonderful introduction, all of you. So today I'm going to give you a brief overview about how COVID-19 was handled in Kerala, a province in India. Before I actually jump into the local responses that was there in Kerala, I would first like to give you a brief overview of the social, spatial, political, and economic situation in Kerala, because this gives you an idea of why it was handled the way it was handled. To give you an idea of the geographical context, this is a province in the southern part of India. It is a coastal province. And when compared to many of the other Indian provinces, where you have one major city and you have a lot of other smaller towns and villages, here the urbanization is largely polycentric. So you have a series of small and medium-sized towns, which are spread along the coast. And because of a well-connected transportation, it is quite common for people to actually be from one part of the state and then be working and living in other parts. And if I use myself as an example, my parents are from two small towns in the district that you see here, Pathanamthitta. I did my bachelor's in architecture in Trivandrum, which is the capital of Kerala. Then I worked as an architect for 2.5 years in Kozhikode, and I'm currently basing my research in Wayanad. So this is very common for many of us who are from there. A very enterprising advertising campaign in 1990 tried to market Kerala as God's own country, mainly because of its abundant nature and the fact that there is a lot of beaches, backwaters, and mountains. And this is probably also a little bit of an invitation for you that in case you want to look for places to go after the lockdown, then you are welcome to go if you are into nature. In terms of spatial morphology, so it's a very tropical place since it is from the southern part of India, where the minimum temperature is 21 degrees and it can come to almost about 45 degrees. So in previous times before air conditioning became the norm, the housing structure used to be quite sloping roofs where you had openings in the top of the roof, which could enable cross ventilation and circulation. However, as the city started to become more dense, what is now seen quite common is that you have middle and high-rise buildings, which are kind of operating in a kind of sprawl situation alongside big road infrastructures. One thing that people of Kerala take a lot of pride in is the fact of religious harmony. And here I try to use this picture as an example, which is from Trivandrum. So here you can see a church in the right side of the road. In the immediate vicinity, you have a mosque, and right next door, you have a temple, which is traditionally the place of faith for people of the Hindu religion. And largely, this religious harmony is considered as one of the strengths of the communities in Kerala. With regard to politics, so it is quite common in many other parts of the world where religious values are strongly aligned with political values. Whereas here you could see that anomalies are quite the norm. And I used the picture in the center here as an example, where you see a young Muslim woman in a hijab who is a very proud advocate of the leading party, which is called the Communist Party of India. And I am very aware that since many of us are from different parts of the world, the term communism has a negative connotation because it is usually relating to totalitarian governments. But here, one thing that could probably be useful to mention is that since Kerala is a province within India and democratic elections are the norm, typically this does not happen where the government is then going to be totalitarian. And people, I would also like to say, are not politically loyal in the sense that they are only advocates of one party, but instead that if the government does not perform, they are voted out. So in the last 63 years of the formation of Kerala, very few times has the same government been actually voted into power again. Some of the things that are useful to mention with regards to the development reforms in Kerala. So I use the term here as reforms also quite cautiously, but some things that they tried to do when they had started ruling was that on the one hand, there was a lot of focus on decentralizing the public health system. So there was a health clinic in every single village. Aside of that, every sub-administration unit had hospitals. There was also a heavy investment in education, which meant that the literacy level is quite high. This document that you see on the left is called the Kerala Land Reforms Act, which was introduced in the early 1960s. And this was done as a way to enable social mobility for the marginalized sections. So previously in the past, a feudal system of landholding used to be practiced, where people from the higher sections of the society or higher caste, if I may use the Indian terminology, they used to hold the land, and people from the lower sections used to be either bonded laborers there. So this was a very unfair practice. So then to enable them to also come up in terms of getting an increased access to education and an increased better quality of life, this reform was introduced. Of course, when it was introduced, there was a lot of opposition. But when I kind of think of it 80 years on, I like to believe that many of the people think it was a very good thing to do because largely a lot of inequalities in the society was kind of redistributed because of this act. In addition, for people who are below poverty line, the government has also always introduced this idea of free rice ration, which means that even if you are not able to afford basic nutrients, the government will supply it for you. In terms of governance, so typically in India, this is the form of governance that is practiced. So in terms of economic planning, we have 4 levels. In terms of spatial planning, there are 2 levels. So typically regional level is only practiced in mega city agglomerations such as Delhi and Mumbai. And then for local administrative purposes, you have 4 tiers here. And one of the things that is kind of seen as a strength of Kerala is the fact that the local governance is quite developed. And this was part of a campaign called the People's Planning Campaign in the mid-1990s, which meant that the urban areas would then be governed by municipalities and the rural areas would be governed by Gram Panchayat. So Gram means village. And this meant that a substantial administrative and fiscal power were then transferred to the villages or people who govern villages. And this meant that various things like developing local physical development plans or revenue taxation was then the responsibility of the local governance. In spite of all these positive things, it has to be also said that in sociological terms, the development characteristics of Kerala is still called a development paradox. This meant that in spite of social development and having development indicators that are at par with developed countries, this social development has not translated into economic development. So you will often see reports where unemployment is still a problem in Kerala. Alcoholism is also quite on the rise. And if you compare national averages of suicide rates, Kerala is the highest in India, almost 3 times the average. And this is, of course, a fact that mystifies many people, because especially if you compare with other countries in the global south, especially from East Asia, where social development then translated to economic development, this was actually not seen here. And if you are somebody who tries to understand these things through fiction, I recommend that you read the book, which is put on the right here. In terms of environmental uncertainty, because it is a coastal province, a climate change and sea level rise can mean that a large parts of the state would be inundated, especially if the sea level rise even rises by 1 meter. The temperature is also set to rise. By 2050, they predict that at least 2 degrees would rise. So many parts are actually highly vulnerable to this. And in addition to that, because of man-made influence, because of a shortage of land, many wetlands and paddy fields are then converted for real estate development. And this also really harms how land and space is seen in Kerala. Now, coming to the actual topic of today about responses to the COVID-19, some things that have to be mentioned in tandem with that is 2 events that happened in 2018 and 2019 was very decisive for how Kerala actually dealt with the COVID. So one was the unexpected heavy monsoon floods. When it first happened in 2018, they had not seen a flood of that magnitude for almost a century. This meant that it really took the decision makers by surprise. And then again, it happened in 2019 as well. Similarly, the Nipah virus, which has similar symptoms as the COVID virus, this was also found in both 2018 and 2019. And through this, many of the decision makers at various levels actually learned a lot of lessons. And this could actually be seen in the way that how they handled the COVID-19. So some of the things that they did when the COVID-19 happened was, aside of the World Health Organization protocol, which talked about test, trace, isolate, and support, they did very vigorous testing, which meant that they tried to produce the results of the diagnosis in 48 hours, when compared to many other countries where you had to wait 7 days to see if you were diagnosed with the COVID or not. And then some of the first clusters of people who were infected was, one was a person who was returning from Wuhan, China, and another was a group of people who had gone to Venice as tourists and then returned. And the group of people who had gone to Venice were actually vague about the fact that they had actually gone there. And what the decision makers actually did was they traced them down and then actually managed to map exactly where they had been and then published it so that all the people who were actually there at that place could reflect for themselves and then quarantine themselves if necessary. Aside of that, they've placed a lot of emphasis on information dissemination. So there was always media briefings which were broadcasted live every 2 days, and that was from the Chief Minister's office. So Chief Minister is the head of the state. He is usually accompanied then by the health minister and also other decision makers. They also try to always update of how many new cases and new confirmed cases of COVID was there. And in addition, they also try to spread awareness by posting links to their apps and YouTube channels, which gave people indications of how to actually assess if you had the COVID and what are the symptoms and how you could take care of yourselves. There was also a recognition of institutional limitations because, of course, the province has a scarcity of resources. So this poster on the left that you see is actually a call for volunteers who could actually help with awareness campaigns or maybe information technology related issues. And the one on the right side that you see is actually masks. And these masks are actually made by people in prisons because there was a lot of shortage of masks. And basically it was done with an understanding that even if you are incarcerated, you are a valued member of the society. They also tried to support marginalized sections of the society because there was, when the lockdown happened, it was seen that there was an increase in the amount of physical abuse, especially towards women. And this poster actually published toll-free numbers where people could get in touch if they were abused by anybody during the lockdown. Similarly, this message that you see on the right side, this is actually related to, so there are a lot of people from other parts of India who are working in Kerala as daily wage laborers. So instead of calling them informal workers or migrants, they actually tried to call them guest workers and then try to really take care of them during the period of lockdown, because these are people who actually are dependent on daily wages. So about 170,000 guest workers were accommodated in 5,000 camps, and their needs were taken care of for the ensuing weeks. This is maybe, let's say, if you compare it to other parts of India where you might have seen distressing images of many of these poorer sections who had to walk back home because nothing was actually done to address their problems. For celebration of religious festivals as well. So people place a lot of emphasis on religious festivals. For example, Easter for the Christians and Ramzan for the Muslims. And while people were encouraged to celebrate, they were asked to celebrate with a lot of caution. And then the one thing that they actually did was that the decision makers consulted the local faith leaders regarding this. So there was a general awareness that, of course, when you celebrate, you have to do it with responsibility. We as a culture are very much into storytelling and using humor as a tool. And this was also used to very good effect. And to give you two examples of how they did that, so there is this picture on the left, which shows Kerala as a person in a boxing ring, which is kind of boxing away the COVID-19 virus. And the one on the right side where characters such as soap, mask, and your hand wash can actually be your friends who will help you deal with the COVID-19. I now come to the end of my presentation. So this woman on the right side that you see, she is the Health Minister of Kerala. She is largely credited as the reason for why a state which has 35 million people only lost 4 people to the virus. So this was written along the mid of May. So at the time of writing, they had only lost 4 people. And part of the reason is they credited to her, but she herself acknowledges that she could not have done this without the Kerala development model. So my concluding thought here, and I'm very curious to see what our audience have to say about this as well, that despite limitations in institutional mechanisms, a scarcity of resources and chronic inequalities, factors such as decentralized governance and community resourcefulness can actually help developmental contexts such as Kerala to handle unexpected events such as the COVID-19. I'm going to stop here now. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Mridula. Thank you for this very interesting presentation. I'm quite curious to see the debate after, especially after this bold statement about the decentralization, which is I think it's something very that we can definitely discuss after. So everyone, what we're gonna do is that please don't send your question now. We're gonna collect them. You can either put on the chat for everyone or just send directly to Roberto Rocco. And Roberto is collecting all the questions, and then we can bring them back in the discussion and the roundtable in the end. So I would like to move to our second speaker now. So now we're going to have Igor Carvalho. He's a Brazilian urban planner with a master's degree in geography from the University of Paris, Sorbonne, and urban planning from the University of São Paulo, where he's currently a PhD candidate. Igor has worked as an advisor at the Municipality of São Paulo and has academic and professional experience in Latin America, Europe, Africa, and Asia. I'm very curious to hear Igor as well, because Igor I met during my PhD research when I went to Brazil, and the city of São Paulo has changed a lot since then. So welcome, Igor. We're happy to have you here. You have the floor, and you can just share your screen.
Okay. Thank you very much, Igor. Thank you, Rocco, for invitation. Thank you, all the organizers. Can you hear me properly?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Well.
Okay, so I'll start sharing my screen. Can you see it?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so for this presentation, I'm calling this Brazil Between Pandemic and Dystopia and the Urban Challenges of São Paulo. So let's first take a look in Brazil, what's going on here. As you might know, Brazil may soon become the first country in COVID-19 cases if this rhythm of spread is kept, according to the White House projections. And also some numbers from yesterday, Brazil has already had more than 900,000 confirmed cases, more than 45,000 1,000 confirmed deaths. And we have to consider these numbers might be much higher actually, because Brazil tests only 0.6% of its population, while the US tests about 7% and the UK about 9%. So what's the federal government has done so far? Well, I think I have seen this in many medias. He has denied the existence or even the relevance of the pandemic in several speeches. He has promoted an anti-social isolation attitude. He has changed the Minister of Health twice, since both did not agree with his ideas. He omitted official data. He challenged and teased state governors and has encouraged the use of hydroxychloroquine as a medicine for COVID, although science has proven to be inefficient. Oh, sorry, I have to, my computer is going down, battery. Just wait a minute, please. I think it's okay now. So this is a very complicated situation. We are living a pandemic crisis, but also a political one. So the combination of both, I'm calling dystopia, okay? And what about São Paulo? São Paulo, you might know, is the richest and biggest city in Brazil, one of the most unequal cities in the country, and a city that presents a huge challenge in housing and mobility issues. Well, the numbers also from yesterday of the pandemic in São Paulo, more than 105,000 cases confirmed cases, more than 11,000 deaths already happened in the city. And well, we have to consider that lockdown was never applied in the city, only a very flexible quarantine, okay? So social isolation index was never higher than 59%, which was achieved only one day. This picture was taken in the last week, and it's very terrifying if we consider the numbers of the pandemic nowadays. The numbers of confirmed cases and deaths in the city keeps increasing steadily since March. I argue that besides the lack of federal clear policies for lockdown and investments, urban inequalities are also directly connected to the spread of the pandemic. Urban and social aspects that might have an influence, inadequate housing, the lack of water supply, and spatial segregation and mobility issues. So as I mentioned before, social isolation is very low, and people have to people have to work. So workers usually live in the outskirts of the city, and they can stay like hours in commuting to achieve their job places. This is a picture that was taken last week in Rio, but the conditions of mobility in São Paulo are quite similar. It's complicated here because people can get sick in commuting, while commuting. This map shows the concentration of jobs here in purple in the main downtown area, and in the outskirts you have yellow and red dots representing the concentration of vulnerable people in a very dense way. So they have this show us pretty much on how spatially segregated the city is. And I prepared a couple of maps to show you housing conditions effects on the COVID pandemic in São Paulo. Here we have confirmed deaths per district, and the darkest red, the higher the number of deaths that was identified in the district. And we also can see that the darkest districts are also the ones with a huge number of slums. But if we compare not the total cases per district, but the total cases to this district population, then we have another configuration. We have downtown area highlighted. And this is also because of housing precarious conditions, this time not because of slums, but because of precarious rental housing. So at least 8,000 households live in precarious rental housing, such as this one in the picture. At least 24,000 homeless people live in the streets, and counting, because evictions of informally occupied lands has not stopped even during the pandemic. And this is a couple of pictures that were taken yesterday. Another eviction, and 900 families are on the streets right now because of this policy, this eviction that was made, and no solution was provided so far during the pandemic. So it's very complicated, okay? At least 1.7 million people live in slums in São Paulo, such as this one in the picture. And about 6% of people that live in the city has no access to water supply, mainly in the favelas, in the slums, right? Is this the lack of public policy? No, actually, we do have very interesting and progressive urban and housing policies. I have to mention that the São Paulo Master Plan was recognized by the United Nations as one of the best practice during the Habitat 3 conference. And also the municipal housing plan is a very progressive one, but it's still waiting to be voted at the city council, already 4 years so far. So if the government's not doing their best, what can we talk about civil society? According to, well, citizen solidarity, I have to say, social housing movements have controlled suspicious cases. Entities in support of homeless people has done advocacy towards solutions to protect homeless people. Neighborhoods movements have been asking for hospitals in peripheral and central areas. Academia has undertaken research for vaccines and elaborate also digital maps on the geography of the spread of the coronavirus. And I need to highlight the experience of Paraisópolis. This is a picture from HOCO. Here, Paraisópolis is the biggest slum in the city, with more than 100,000 people. For there, 420 local volunteers were assigned by the community association to be street presidents. They are in charge of supervising about 50 households in their assigned streets. They have to identify those with COVID-19 symptoms and call the public health service in case of need. Their schools were transformed in temporary shelter for confirmed COVID-19 infected people, so to avoid them to bring virus home. And move forward to my last part of my presentation, towards utopia.
So, Igor, just please keeping in mind the time constraints we have. Sorry.
Yes. Okay, so considering dystopia and utopia, three levels of policies. In the short term, we need to implement urban reform and implement policies that we have done. The second level, we need to pay attention to the risks of the new urban normal regulation and the risks of increasing gentrification in outskirts and in inner city. And we need to also, in a post-pandemic city, reinvent urban governance, produce cities in a non-capitalist basis. Well, perhaps we can achieve the right to the city and the urban revolution as stated by Lefebvre. If I can, this is the last slide, a picture of the demonstration that took place last week. I think this kind of demonstration, Black Lives Matter, is really important because mainly in the outskirts of São Paulo, where people are dying, they are Black people. So I think that struggles of civil society gives us hope. Thank you, and sorry for exceeding my time.
Thank you, Igor. Yeah, actually, you just went 1 minute over time, so it was not that bad.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for your interesting presentation. And yeah, again, São Paulo is always based on this inequality between center and periphery. Yeah? It's impressive how all the issues always come back to the same problem, same challenge between the center and the periphery. So I think this is also a nice link to our next presenter, which is Javier Ruiz Tagle-Verano, because Javier also looks into a bit inequality. Well, as I mentioned before, we're going to have the discussion after the presentation, so please keep sending your questions on the chat. So Roberto is collecting them, and then we can bring them back after all the 4 presenters. So the next presenter is Javier Ruiz Tagle-Verano. He graduated as an architect and obtained his master at the University of Chile and his PhD from the University of Illinois. His work focuses on themes of residential segregation, neighborhood effects, self-management in housing projects, among others. He's currently involved in 4 research projects where he accumulates the position of assistant professor of the Institute of Urban and Territorial Studies from the Pontifical Catholic University of Chile, associate researcher from the Center of Sustainable Urban Development, and principal investigator of the research group in urban marginality. So Javier, thank you, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I wanted to start here. This is my balcony, just to show you 2 factors. First, winter is starting, just starting. This is full of leaves in the streets. And second, the amount of cars on the streets. Why? So that's a big question for my presentation. So I will return to my desk because it's cold outside and it's getting colder. And I will show you why this was important. So thank you very much again for inviting me. It's been a pleasure, and it's absolutely amazing to be more connected than before in these situations. Because if not, I would never have gone to Delft maybe. So this is a great invitation and great opportunity. So my presentation, I put the title Urban Perspective from the End of the World. The end of the world because we are at the end of the map, but also because we are very close to the end of the world, at least in this country. So we are at the peak of the virus. I will be very brief and show you just a little glimpse about the situation. So we are actually at the top. These are the maps and the graphs from our world in data. We have the maximum number in the world of confirmed cases per million of people, more than Brazil, more than the United States, more than Spain, more than Italy, more than everybody. And this is really, really bad for us. Then we have the deaths per million of inhabitants. We still don't have that amount of deaths, but we had a lot of problems with data, actually, political problems with data. I will show you afterwards. But we are very close to Ecuador, very close to Peru, very close to Brazil, within Latin America in the amount of deaths that we have. In terms of Santiago metropolitan regions, which is my city, we are still growing in the rate of positive cases, and we have had some changes in our methodologies of testing. So we have some numbers over there, but the blue line is the important, which we have this growing amount of people here in this city. So the story about how this spread is very similar as every other city had. All of this started in China. The people who travel from China, of course, they are from the elite. And the elite part of the city started with this first cases of infection, and then that spread throughout the poorest areas, which is a similar story, I guess, for every city in the world, especially in the global south. So this is our socioeconomic distribution. If you see here, these are the confirmed cases as of March 18th. The richest 10% actually lives in those areas. So those travelers coming from China were the ones who brought the virus. And then we have all poverty here in the south and the northeast of the city and the northwest of the city. And then we have that movement, which is really, really obvious. All people were, most employment areas were over here. The central business district is over here, but then a lot of people working as domestic workers or informal workers were working in upper class areas, and then they go home, of course, and they started to spread the virus. And then you see that all poverty areas are starting to erupt with the virus, and the other areas are not very problematic at this time. So they have less, in these poor areas, of course, they have less facilities of all types in terms of healthcare, in terms of basic supplies. They have low quality housing, higher densities, overcrowding, and all types of problems, social problems that are common, as I said, in the global south. So how did we get there? We have two contextual factors. First is the one that I show you in my balcony, is that winter is just starting. We usually have actually a winter campaign every year due to the increase of respiratory diseases, especially in Santiago. Santiago is a very polluted city, so we have to reduce the number of cars that are moving. We have to increase the number of doctors working in every hospital. So starting a winter, just starting a winter at the peak of the coronavirus is really, really problematic for us. And then we are under a severe crisis of political credibility, which started after our social outbursts in October 2019, last year, a couple of months ago. Actually, we did have a lot of demonstrations from October to March. March was our last big march. It was the March 8th for feminism. And then the country started to slow because, of course, of the virus. But people don't believe politicians. So in a country where people don't believe politicians, it's very, very difficult to enforce any kind of measure for controlling the virus. So in that context, on top of that, we have institutional failures. We have the so-called partial quarantines in Greater Santiago, in which we have only a few municipalities at a given time that were put into quarantine. First, some of these upper status areas, then other poor areas, but never the entire city until 3 weeks ago. So poor people had to continue moving from one municipality to the other in our city, and long distance, very similar to what Igor was showing in Sao Paulo. So as a result, our daily mobility only decreased by 10 to 30%, which is very, very low decrease. And the contact tracing, which was also very important for the control of this virus, we had only 60% of the people that were tracked. So most people that were infected, a lot of people that were infected, they were just lost. We lost track of them. Then we have political failure in terms of data management. This is the image of our Ministry of Health. There are a lot of issues of lack of transparency regarding the number of active cases and deaths. There were inconsistencies between the death counts sent to the World Health Organization and the Chilean press, different numbers to both organizations. And the Secretary of Health was actually blamed for altering evidence, concealing data, and covering trends. And he just resigned like three days ago. Maybe resigned before a constitutional accusation against him, but he just resigned, and we have a new ministry. Then we had economic failure. Here, this image is one of a big tower in the center of the city, and some artists projected with light. They projected the word hunger. Why? Because we have no social protection for the poor. until a couple of days ago. The government allowed actually employers to evade the salaries for workers who are not attending their work. Basic services and loans are charged every month. We have not stopped that. They have a first measure of a one-time bonus of $64 per person. Then they try to improve that for a monthly bonus of $70 per person for 3 months. And then the final measure that just approved 3 days ago with a consensus between different political parties is a monthly bonus of $128 per person for 3 months, which is almost above the line of poverty, which is some kind of dignity for a lot of people, but still is a problem because our quarantine from 3 weeks ago in this city is total, but still people is still moving. So we need more strict measures, but without money we cannot do that. So they just approved the money, and now we are waiting for the really strict measures for containing this crisis. So the unveiled face of urban inequality, this is almost common sense. Like I have seen thousands, I don't see cents and dozens of blogs and opinions of people that coronavirus has unveiled, has showed, has unmasked all the inequalities, which is, of course, is obvious. So we have on one side upper status group, which can easily work at home. They live in low density houses and neighborhoods. They have no children or less children, which are vectors of contagion. They maintain their income. They don't need social contacts for their daily survival. They have quick access to supply facilities and quality healthcare. So, and the lower class groups, and here I have a picture of demonstration during the quarantine, actually, for people that were dying for hunger. They live in dense and precarious dwellings. They need to work outside for bringing something to eat. They have large families with children. They are losing or reducing their income. They are heavily dependent on others for the daily survivors, which means, of course, contagion. And they live very far from supply and healthcare facilities. So all of those parts, those extreme parts of the social spectrum, they of course explain why poor people is suffering more and more about this, and why inequalities is of course being unmasked during this crisis. And we have more. We are continuing in the middle of this crisis. The health department, they just acknowledged 31,000 more positive cases that have not been informed so far. And this happened yesterday. So we are around 250,000 cases in total in our country, which per million puts us again at the top in the world. And this is really, really severe. And people is not really believing in the statistics of the government and the measures, and they are trying to protect themselves with their local governments, with their communities. But it's really, really concerning for all of us. So I will leave it like this. Thank you very much, and I hope to continue with the questions afterwards.
Thanks a lot, Javier. That was very interesting. Thanks for the quick update on the situation in Chile. And it's also a big discussion to see how is this, is it Brazil or is it Chile that is having even more challenges now? But I thought it was very interesting, 2 points that you mentioned, maybe we can discuss later. One is this lack of trust with the government and how can we move forward after this pandemic to build this trust. And the other one is actually the lack of reliable data, that it's something that we've been struggling for a long time, not even now in this crisis, but in this crisis became very clear that this is a structural problem that a lot of Latin American countries face now. Talking about the availability of data, I will move to our next speaker, which is George Zaborski. George is an architect and urban planner based in Minsk. George is one of the founders of the Minsk Urban Platform, even though he's not working there anymore. But the Minsk Urban Platform has an active role in the Minsk Urban Forum, which is a very inspirational event where I had the pleasure to participate a few years ago. And I saw how George has a big role in influencing new and young planners in Minsk. George is also mentioned in the documentary Made in BY, which is an abbreviation for Belarus, would highlight the most creative minds of Belarus, where young entrepreneurs manage to thrive in a country where 80% of the economy is controlled by the government. So today he leads the George Zaborski Studio, and we are happy to have him here and hear a bit about his experience and vision on the urban environment post-COVID-19. So thanks for coming, George, and the floor is yours.
Hello. As Igor mentioned before, I'm going mostly to talk about post-COVID solutions, because now I'm working with my studio for one of the largest housing development companies in Belarus, and we are trying to design kind of toolbox for post-COVID design, which have to be not only dealing with epidemic situations, but also with another ongoing crises. But before talking about solutions, I understand that I have to make, like a small different background in my country. So the key difference is that we have no real situation of poverty now, because we have very authoritarian government, but very liberal way in economy. So it's like a contradiction of authoritarian government, which has been not changed like for 26 years. There's one person and one government, but different from other authoritarian countries, we have like a very liberal and very like late capitalism economy. So it differs. We have no real poverty, but we have a lot of precarious people because prices are very high. And it's another situation. We have no homeless people, but we have like millions of people afraid of losing their homes and afraid of losing their workplaces. And the issue is that our government decided to totally ignore the COVID-19. So it appears like there is no COVID, no epidemic situation, nothing. People continue to work at their workplaces, and the decision of about self-isolation, self-lockdown, self-quarantining is just made by some large companies, mostly high-tech companies. So most of people just continue living their regular life, and it makes most of trouble in the capital, because our capital grown up from 1 million to 3 millions in the last 10 years. So it's like, you know, all the transportation become very long and very dense. And I think I have to stop with, this background and to talk about what we are doing in our toolbox for post-COVID design. And now I'll share a screen, 1 second. I think here it is, yeah. So first of all, I have 4 points to talk about, like 4 highlights. The first is that, like, it's widely discussed now that as more we intrude the natural territories, as more we grow our cities, as more we have such epidemic issues with new zootropic viruses. So that's the first issue we have to design, is to design new boundaries between urban and cultural landscape and natural landscape. And we have some cues here. The second thing is that we are now faced with the thing that public transportation is not, it's not a panacea anymore. While we were before dealing mostly with ecological issues and we were trying to use more public transportation, now we have to use it less. And now in Belarus, for example, the public transportation is the main place where the virus is spreading. So we have to design another way of shared mobility, multimodal transport systems, and we are designing it in our new toolbox. The third part is that we have to rethink the workspaces, because we have not to shorten any public transportation in means of culture, in means of social interaction, in means of rest. So the only one thing we can shorten is try to shorten the work migration, everyday work migration, mostly from outskirts of the city to the city center. And we are trying to design that multimodal system of transportation, which will deal with three things, like with public transportation, with individual light transportation, like bicycles, electric bicycles, and so on, and personal cars, because here it means like 80% of people have their own personal private car. And we have to somehow build a management system for that. And we are working with mobile applications, which will help to build that complex multimodal routes for everyone to move using all the transportation systems. That means that we can lower the use of personal transportation and also lower the use of a lot of public transportation, using in part of seasons a lot of that light transportation and mixture. And the last one questions I want to talk about is that here in Belarus, we had a very good example of volunteers activity, which was very technical based volunteers activity. When it started to be obvious that the epidemic issues will be enforced and will increase because of medical workers being exposed to COVID-19, it started from Apple challenge, and just 3 days after Apple write the challenge about participating of local makers and hackers in creating personal instruments and personal tools for medics, we started to do it. It was like based on Minsk hackerspace, that's a place for hackers and makers. And here you can see the article. Everything started from that article. It was at the beginning, the hackerspace was like 30 people working on their own different technical projects. But in 10 days, it appears like it was thousands of different people spread in 3 groups. First group was designing and redesigning. It was very fast evolution of means of making safety for medical workers. The second group was producing it. I was a part of that second group, and now my balcony is full of 3D printers and different equipment. And what we were producing were different elements of personal isolation for medical workers, like that element. You can see it on the pictures from São Paulo. Some people are also wearing that self-made elements, which helps you to have a screen here. We also were producing masks, like on that image, where it was. Yeah, like on that image, using standard scuba masks and changing it by 3D printing. And the third group was distributing it between medical centers around the country, not only in our city. And it appears that we shorten the weighting of normal equipment. And we also were producing oxygenators, also 3D printed elements for oxygenators. And it helps us to meet the problem. And if to talk a bit, just a bit, because we have a time for questions, about the new toolbox we are developing, I can just show you that in some parts. That's pity that it's only made for one company, so we have to discuss later, would we share it with everyone, because I want to share it, but there is a company who is financing the toolbox for their housing development. That's an issue. Here you can see some elements of planning that new multimodal transportation system with changing also of the structure of the streets in new built housing districts. And also, I mentioned that we are trying to change the working surroundings. We are trying to design houses, big housing blocks, and even flats, even living modules, with the places to work distantly. Because now we have a lot of digital economy here in Belarus, but people still using transportation to move to the center to work in the office. Mostly because there is no normal structures for work at home. Like for me, I was totally rebuilding my house to just to have a studio here. And now we're trying to design new housing, which will include the possibility in any epidemic situation or any other kind of crisis to work from home. And also we're trying to design, again, redesign the housing of mixed type with a lot of working places integrated with housing, because last like 60 years from the Soviet time, Belarus is mostly about separated housing and living areas and highly concentrated working areas. We are trying in our toolbox and in our new districts we are designing to avoid that and to come back to mixed-use buildings and mixed-use areas, just to shorten that transportation and make communities more local, to leave transportation mostly for social use, not for going to work. I think that's all the main issues I want to highlight, like Z4, which are, again, just to mention, which has that boundary between rural and wild and urbanized territories, because now here we have like 5 new zoonoses which are not COVID-19, but we are facing them, and we have to redesign the boundaries. The second is that new multimodal transportation system which will balance between public and light private transportation, rethinking the workplaces and thinking about the role of that hacker and maker communities in dealing with new challenges. And I wanna ask you and provide an idea of making a research in different countries, in your countries, about the role of that local hacker and maker community, because I saw that it has a very large impact here, and I want to try to understand how it depends on the economy of city, on the policy of city, and try to understand how to use the experience we have here, very good one, with another cities, with another political and economical structures. I think that's all, and I want to later join a discussion. Maybe we'll even decide to make a new spread research. Thank you.
All right, thank you, George, for your presentation. Yeah, it's very interesting. That's indeed an interesting point about how the local economy has been activated now in this situation of this emergency situation that we're living now. I can tell you by the example of TU Delft, our university, how we have tried to scale up different projects, initiatives that are focusing on combating the COVID-19. But yeah, I think this is also a question for the other presenters. So I guess Roberto will now take the floor and discuss further this the questions, right, Roberto?
Maybe Caroline, would you like to start?
Yes, sure. Thank you, Roberto. Yes. Well, these were very interesting presentations, very fascinating to hear all these different inputs from different places. And there are actually 4 points that that really struck me through all the presentations, and I will try to bring them together in these 4 points. So the first was about the role of governments and the role of civil society. And it seems that in the different stories from Kerala to Sao Paulo to Santiago, and the last story as well, the role of the politician and the governments played an important role in the sort of the severeness of the pandemic and how it is being handled. And for me, it sort of helps me to reflect about what is really the idea of being politically engaged. And then you see that the story of the minister in Kerala is very inspiring. I think she really goes back to what politics should be about, and sort of this responsibility for the community at large. And that brings me to the role of the civil society, where you see that today in this kind of crisis situation, it shows that people are able to take responsibilities. Whereas we often think we need politicians to manage everything. No, we see that the civil society is really taking their responsibility towards the society as a whole. And if you look at the case of the prisoners, it's a very nice example, but also that of the hacker community. And that brings me to another point, and then talking about the responsibilities of governments, politicians, of civil society. That brings me also to the role of the economy and the sort of the private sphere. When you mentioned the copyright issues, maybe it's also a moment to rethink not only the democratic organization of cities and regions, but also reflecting on this notion of the sharing economy. What can it really be? And can we ensure that it's not being appropriated again by liberal democrat capitalist forces? The third element actually then is about the revaluation of the local, and this local embeddedness and the valuing of what is maybe the genius loci of a certain place. What is the local potential? And then the last point I want to raise is that it's very clear in all the stories that the pandemic is actually magnifying the urban inequality. The workers at the front line are being hit the hardest. They lose their jobs first, and they're also in closest proximity to the dangers. So on the one hand, reflecting on the future, we really need to reevaluate these jobs and this sector. But on the other hand, it also means that this pandemic, together with what I said in the beginning, is really, it's not only about health and a virus, it's also about political systems and how we organize our society and our democracies. So that is the points that I sort of took from the presentations. Roberto.
Thank you, Caroline. I don't have a lot to add. I think I noticed the same points, but I would like to just highlight two things that I thought were important, and at the same time I'm looking here to see if people want to get into the webinar. One of the big differences that I see in the different countries is the trust in institutions, right? We go from a government that builds trust by providing, for example, rice to its inhabitants, but also by having a communication strategy that is very good, to governments that don't inspire trust. It's really mind-boggling to understand what's going on in Chile because of the neoliberal ideology. So it's like I think we are victims of this dangerous and radical ideology of neoliberalism that is very, very prevalent in Latin America. So from this trust in institutions and trust in governments, I think we should also highlight communication as a central point in how we deal with this pandemic. We have also seen differences in how people are communicating with their citizens, and this has a huge impact again on how people are responding to the pandemic, right? So communication for me is the one, and I'm saying this because I think we as spatial planners and designers, we have a special role in this communicative effort. We have to be communicators as well if we want our cities to succeed. Finally, I just want to, of course, highlight the incredible connection between inequality and rate of infection, right? So we have inequality really bringing, and in the beginning of the pandemic, I remember very well, and by the way, it's incredible how time is fast. Things that happened 3 days ago, they seem like 1 year ago, right? But in the beginning of the pandemic, everybody was talking about the virus as the great equalizer. It would make us all equal because we all suffer from the virus. And that's a fallacy. We are not equal in our resistance and ability to isolate and access to water, electricity, and so on. So having said all that, I think we could go to the questions, if you don't mind. And I will invite everyone to please write your questions in the chat box, but we will start with the people who started before. So we had Matteo. Matteo, would you like to unmute yourself and please tell us the question if you're still there? Is he still there? Yes, he is there.
Hi, it's not. Do you hear me?
Oh yes, you're not Matteo. I can see.
Matteo, yeah, I'm not Matteo, but we are two Matteos next to me actually. But I'm Laura, and I actually wrote the question.
Cool.
So it's okay if I ask.
Sure, go on.
Now I have some more question collected, but and I have to remember the question I actually did.
Your question was about social distancing in Kerala.
Yeah,
how is it possible?
What I missed a bit, especially in the first presentation maybe, but then it became kind of different, is what is the space? I mean, we're, as you mentioned, we are spatial planners, and we are talking, we have to talk about the space. And I was wondering, what is the consequences in a public space? Because one of the issues we have to talk about is the social distancing. And I'm asking myself, because we've been talking about housing, which is something that it's of course very important, but I'm asking myself, what about the open space, you know?
Okay, so maybe Murudula, would you like to start?
Sure. Thank you, Laura, for that question. Indeed, it's a very important aspect as well. I guess my focus was mainly on kind of giving an idea of how the communication strategy and the information was kind of done there, because they, of course, focused a lot on getting people to understand that being under lockdown was really important. So then there was largely the lockdown was followed, I think, for the first 6 to 8 weeks. And definitely it does affect, so on mentally for our personal thing, it does affect if you don't use the public space. But on the other hand, people also understood that if they are responsible, then they can actually be part of this whole thing of where you can contain the virus. So that's part of why I think the public space was not used at that point. And then having also said that, I think because it is a hugely dense province, because if I were to compare it to a European context, Kerala is roughly the size of the Netherlands, but has more than twice the population, so it's 35 million. So our public space, where spaces you can actually go and take a walk or a run, are very, very less. So there are certain parks, there are certain green spaces, but they are few and far in between. So that is maybe one of the reasons why this did not really come up so much in the whole discussion from the part of the decision makers or from the parts of the communities, because that's maybe a space that is not so much there.
So maybe we should give a thank you, Murudula, very much. And other speakers, would you like to react to how is urban space in your cities contributing or not? I know that Sao Paulo has a George. George is raising his hand.
I want to share some experience from here, from Minsk, Belarus, which is very close to Western Europe geographically. So you can imagine the weather. So it was, while we have no official lockdown totally, in the beginning it was a big deal for a lot of public spaces, and especially for businesses in public spaces such as cafes, etc. How to deal to make a kind of self-isolation to help people with their private lockdown or not to participate in that. And it appears that in our neoliberal state, it appears that most of cafes and bars, we have a lot of them, were trying to stop their activity for like a month, and later they were forced to open up again. And now it's very warm on the street, so it was easier in winter. Now it's very, very hot weather, and like a lot of young people, all of them are on the streets and in cafes, and we know that masks, nothing, just because it's about also not only communication. I want to point that it's also about creating the positive image of a person who is trying to somehow contribute in safety. Like, if we'll try to create positive image of a person in mask, it will be better. We'll try to build a positive image of a person who is not going to cafe, it will be better. But now it's terrifying. And what about designing? We are just trying now to enlarge the open spaces in our projects and provide more shelters, like rain shelters on the new built public spaces, to avoid people just being very dense in cafes, to spread them in the parks, for example. That's all.
Thank you. Look, I'm a bit afraid about the time, so maybe we should just go forward with the questions, and then we can come back, right? I think the issue of public space is super important. Here in the Netherlands, we are very, very lucky. We have parks everywhere, so it's quite easy, but that's not the case of most places around the world, right? But Ganesh, can you unmute yourself and ask the question about the development model of Kerala?
Yeah, sure. One second, I'm just getting the question. Yeah. So I was just curious, how much of Kerala's development model is replicable in other Indian states? Because to my understanding, it's largely dependent on foreign remittances as well, and also the geography doesn't allow for a lot of industrial activity. But like looking forward, if that model could be replicated in other states, that would be great. So I was just wondering about your thoughts on that.
Thank you, Ganesh, for your question. And you are absolutely right. So that is part of the negative aspect of the so-called development model, that a lot of their resources actually come from remittances. So it comes from people who are from Kerala but living outside, mainly from the Middle East, or it is from tourism. And this is maybe part of the reason why, like, that people who are educated are kind of forced to go out of Kerala to look for opportunities, because opportunities within the state is quite less. So you are right in that sense that this part definitely cannot be replicated elsewhere, because you would need to have either industries or other kind of sectors to actually help the economy. But on the other hand, I do believe that whatever resources come in, the provinces or the governments actually have a responsibility to distribute the resources in a way that is actually useful for the public. So for instance, here, in spite of the fact that they're only depending on this, there was still a lot of focus on, for instance, investing in public health and education. So if you have the base services well in place, I think that's part of the reason why they were able to also deal with the pandemic. And I think that part actually, irrespective of what their development model or what they base their economy on, this can still be focused on, because this is a bit of how your government prioritizes something.
Oh, that's a great answer. Thank you so much. We will move forward with a very interesting question from Abdel Ghani. Maybe Abdel Ghani, you could tell us about the question on gender. I hope they are still there. Well, maybe they're not there, but they made a, oh, here. They made a good question about gender inequality. Is in your cities, and maybe Igor, you could do you notice gender inequalities in Sao Paulo or in Chile? How do you see that? Hello?
Thank you, Rocco. I have there is a research that was undertaken by Dossier Mulher Rio de Janeiro of last year, showing that about 60% of violence cases against women happen in their houses, in their residential areas. And I think that is something now in this current time that comes to mind, that the time we spend, those who can spend in their homes are much higher now, much longer. And so women are more and more under situations that can bring them to be victims of domestic violence. Actually, according to federal government, there was an increase of 20% of cases of domestic violence in only the first week of quarantine in the country. So I think it's obvious the relation, and we have to face that.
Yeah, there is a gender issue there. Any other speakers would like to?
Yes, I will just add that at least in Chile, the issues of domestic violence are very related to the institutional negligence. And I have had some thesis students working with me and researching some of that. The thing is that authorities or public officials, they don't believe women. And in these cases it's worse because people is locked down and the police have other more important things to do. So every time a woman goes, if they dare to go to the police to denounce their partners, of course they won't believe because they have more important things to do at this moment, because they have other type of emergencies, right? So that will be increasing the situation and worsen it.
Well, this issue of authorities not believing women is widespread, right? It's a problem in many places around the world. Any other, would you like to say something? Otherwise, we can move on to Alejandro. I don't know if Alejandro is still there. So Alejandro is from Latin America, I suppose. Are you there? I don't see him. You can unmute yourselves. Okay, well, the question was about why Latin America is so bad in containing the virus. Why other regions of the world have succeeded much more than we have? Can you Latin Americans answer that question?
Yeah, I'm gonna start with that. Well, we are not equal. Uruguay is doing very well. Costa Rica is doing very well. Salvador is doing very well. Argentina is doing relatively well. The problem with them is that they don't have good data about it. But in Brazil and Chile, we are the worst, definitely, because of this distrust against the government, because the emphasis of them on the economy. They are the elite, actually. They are themselves the elite, so they want to just to protect themselves. They don't really care about people dying. So they don't want to spend any money on people. So we have to put a lot of pressure on them to have a little bit more of money on the economy, on people, to save their lives. Because if not, they will just save their own companies. They are bailing out the big companies for themselves.
So governments that are hesitant to invest in their own peoples. That's really shocking,
I mean,
right?
At the beginning they were just thinking in the economy, not about healthcare, and they say we don't need like complete quarantines, and that will be bad for the economy. But now they are just starting to realize that actually this healthcare crisis is really bad for the economy at all. I mean, it's the entire country that is under lockdown or under a problem of economic insufficiency. And that's bad for the entire economy. and they are just beginning to understand that.
Yeah, good. Igor.
Yeah, I want to add about some Brazil actually, because I think that there is a political issue there very important. In this context, the Brazilian context, government does not only seem to not care about people, but to use the death as a way to explain another coup d'etat. I think that there's an authoritarian wave taking place here. If the situation is so out of control, it would be very important, let's say like this, to have a stronger government, so that the president can force the situation against democracy and towards another coup d'etat.
So they're using the pandemic politically, aren't they?
Yeah, it's necropolitics.
Okay, necropolitics, for those who don't understand the term, is when you have the power to decide who lives and who dies, and that's what politicians in Latin America are doing. Finally, we won't have time for all the questions, but we are really almost there with our webinar. But maybe Sebastian, can you unmute yourself if you're there? And Sebastian Espinosa, you can unmute yourself. Something is going on. Anyway, that's fine. Let's go to the next question. So Aswini is asking, I'm not going to ask you to speak, Aswini, sorry. So we are facing two big threats, the pandemic and climate change. And can we find synergy between the anti-COVID planning solutions, for example, from Belarus, and our combat to climate change? Can we bring these two things together? What do you think? Maybe, yeah, whoever wants to answer that, Nurdullah?
Yeah,
sorry,
George first. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm just reading the question now. So she asks about if mixed-use developments can gain more of our attention. Well, this is the thing. It's because it's definitely about density. So on the one hand, if people are reliable on public transport, their chances of transmission might be higher. But having said that, I think we still should not endorse transportations or developments that actually have to depend on car, because then, I mean, of course, the pandemic is at the moment the most emergency case, but when we think of the long term in terms of climate change and sustainable development, so there has to be, I think, quite a balance. I'm not sure if with all of our knowledge of spatial planning, we have the answers to that, but I would imagine that something in between would be appropriate, in the sense that if something happens, then we can always have a way of shifting. So either maybe invest in, not in car-based transport, but invest in walking and bike paths. For instance, that could be that you're still individual, but you're still not contributing to a carbon footprint.
Cool. George.
Yeah.
Thank you, Nurdullah.
I want to also add that for the first point, I write it here in the chat, that developing that COVID-oriented solutions and epidemic-oriented solutions for planning our new districts, we found that really there is a lot of synergy between solutions aimed to COVID situation and solutions aimed to global warming, such as a lot of working with contact between natural landscape and built landscape, and about balancing the biodiversity and balancing the forestation of territory. Here we see a lot of contacts, not with COVID directly, but a lot of zoonoses here in Belarus, which are affected by shorten of forest territories. So even in that point, and there is 100 of points, we have to discuss it separately. There is, there is such a possibility of finding same solutions for climate change and COVID situation. But if to say about that example with volunteering and technical volunteering, such as our hackerspace and all that thousands of people trying to help the situation, that's the difference. COVID was very obvious, very bright, and very fast. So it was very easy to create a working group, to invite people to help situation. With climate change, the main trouble is that we cannot, for example, in the same hacker spaces around the Belarus, around the Europe, to try to create the same level of activity, because it's, you know, so background situations that we need a real total flood here on the street to create the same way of activity. And I
so
think
the perception of the threat, the perception of the threat is not the same, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. By common people, I think scientists are really convinced, but common people cannot see climate change. Any other, Javier?
Yes, just a short idea. A certain level or appropriate level of district self-sufficiency is an idea that works for both the COVID crisis and works for sustainability, for environmental, social, and economic sustainability. I'm not thinking in the idea of the neighborhood unit, for example, where you have everything in your neighborhood, but at least something. So you can have some jobs, you can have some healthcare facilities, you can have parks. So you can do partial quarantines actually in a neighborhood, in a district, which has everything, and you can have the other parts of the city still working. But if you have the entire city dependent on one part of the city, especially the poor, you have a big problem. So that kind of ideas work both for sustainability and both for the COVID crisis.
Yeah, that's really a good observation. Yeah, thank you. Igor, would you like to say a final word?
Yeah, so I think that if we are able to make cities in which poor people, workers can live in the inner parts of the city, so we can control mobility issues, and that is connected to climate change, but also the spread of COVID, right? So making the city more equal and less segregated is an issue that is not new, but can have a positive impact in our challenge dealing with this epidemic.
All right. Everyone, we have come to the end of our webinar. We are a bit over time, but I think that's fine. But people are starting to leave. I'd like to thank very, very much our guests, Javier, Igor, George, and Murudula from different corners of the world, which is really great. And I'd like to thank also Anja van der Vaart, Caroline Newton, Igor Pessoa, and Luz Vergara, and myself. We are organizing the Global Urban Lab and these webinars. Please keep in mind that on the 24th, we have a webinar with a representative of the European Commission, from the Green Party from the UK, and from a big ONG there, that they will talk about the Green Deal. So they will specifically talk about what can we do to combine actually COVID action and green action. So I really appreciate the presence of everyone here today. We are very happy with the results. This will be it was recorded and will be on our website, and we will write a little report about it as well. So thank you so much, everyone. There is no good way to end a Zoom meeting. I've learned it's horrible. So thank you so much, and I see you very soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.